Welcome, I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. Today we'll be talking about lesson 21 of our study, which covers the second book of Kings, chapter 17, verses 1 through 41. As we left off in the northern kingdom, we saw that Hoshea has become king by the only way you seem to ever become king in the north anymore, murdering the previous king. We also see here that although he is not a good king, he's not as bad as the kings who went before him, for all the good that's going to do at this point. So he reigns 9 years, and last but not least, it's easy to gloss over in this little bit of text here. During this time, Israel becomes a vassal of Assyria, which means they were conquered and now they owe allegiance to Assyria. Not a great situation. They don't have autonomy anymore to govern entirely on their own. So things not going so well up north. Now, as we finally arrive at something that's been teased at for a long time, it almost seems anticlimactic. Israel is a vassal of Assyria. The king decides to be naughty and not follow the terms of the vassalage. The king of Assyria comes in, besieges the capital city of Samaria. From now on, all of the people up in this northern region are fair game to refer to as Samaritans, which is what this land will be called. And so when in the Gospels we see a Samaritan, we mean someone from the land that is the northern kingdom. The king of Assyria comes in and deports their means of dealing with people who were rebellious and who were conquered was, we don't leave them all in their land together because they'll get up to no good. So they cross-settle people in all the lands that they have. So you end up with some of the original people, but mostly other people you bring in from elsewhere. And then those pesky Israelites get sent all over the place. And by intermingling, there's not enough people getting together of common view and background, and they're not protecting their original homeland. They don't have anything to fight for. So you kind of, in theory, and pretty well in practice, diffuse the situation and calm people down a lot. So, as we've seen is coming for quite some time, Israel has been conquered and deported. Well, if you've been paying any attention at all, you already know why the people in Israel are being deported, but lest there be any confusion, let's go through the laundry list of these are the things that they did. The text reminds us this is the God who brought them out of slavery in Egypt, reminding them they had every reason, and of course they had sworn a covenant to follow and serve the Lord, and then they abandoned the things of the Lord for the things of the world, both the king and the people. The fact that the kings went astray, not good, but the people let themselves be led astray and then themselves also sought these things. So it was not only that the kings were bad. There's an interesting line here. The sons of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. Does that mean that God didn't know about it because they were getting away with it? Well, obviously the evidence in the text bears that they did not get away with it. So it means I think it means they attempted to kind of, when we're sinning, right, we don't do it in broad daylight and let everybody know what we're doing. We hide it and we try to keep it to ourselves. They knew they were doing wrong things, and so they tried to be kind of stealthy about it, but certainly God knew what they were doing. And again, this bears it out. A lot of the worship of false idols and wrong religious practices, again, are the main reasons God is ultimately a jealous God and wants us to love and serve him. And will do just about anything to get our attention because he knows it's for our own good, including, in this case, capture and deportation. And the list continues. People, more emphasis on idols, false gods, We see the people described very accurately as stubborn. I think it's interesting with that descriptor to reflect on the fact that they also chose to call themselves the people of Israel. If you remember way back to when Jacob was renamed Israel, the name means he who wrestles with God. It is an apt name for this kingdom. They were constantly setting themselves in conflict with and in opposition to God. And ultimately, it's that spirit of opposition that led them to do all of these other things that led to the demise of their kingdom and their deportation. They set themselves opposed to God, and they instead turned over their worship to pretty much anything else they could find, including golden calves and the Baals, and really anything that happened to cross their path. They were exceedingly not loyal. And as a result, this is the end of the kingdom of Israel. There is not now nor, well, I guess to say there never will be again a kingdom of Israel kind of doesn't fit in our own day, because we do have a nation of Israel again. But leaving that aside, the kingdom as it existed back then is never again a thing. It's not an autonomous people in that region of the Holy Land with that connection with Judah, and we see the only tribe that's left from the Lord's point of view is Judah. And anyone else now who ultimately comes back from these people who have been scattered is going to come back, and the name of the people ultimately becomes Jews from the word Judah. Any Israelites who make their way back are going to become Jews, not Israelites. From this time onward, the legacy of these 10 tribes is gone. Although the idea of God's people as a whole people remains. And a fascinating thing that God's pulled off here. These are all still his people, but this kingdom that is this, and we saw it in the prophets talking about some of this in Hosea, he doesn't care about the kingdom at all. He cares about the people, and he can cut off the institution. That's not a thing that is of any value. But he does still continue to call back these people who are his people. But the institution of the kingdom and even of the tribes are not what's important to him. And so Israel and all that it stands for, except the people, is gone. And now all we have left here are these people. And what is God going to do to continue to call them back? We will keep seeing. But this thing that was will not be again. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God. So this problem that we've seen lead to this extreme consequence in the north is not limited only to the north. And we should trace and look at, again, the similarities and the differences between the northern and the southern kingdom. And the text invites us to do that by going back to the beginning of the northern kingdom. How did this even start? Well, it was because of the sons of Solomon that 10 of the tribes were torn from Judah. And that consequence was, at the time, not only a call to division, but a call for correction, and the opportunity for reunion of the people was still inherent in that original split. And for unified worship of the Lord. But almost immediately, Jeroboam rejected the worship of the Lord, as did the people of the northern kingdom, which pretty well sealed their fate from the beginning. So that then you have, again, the difference between the kingdom and the people. You have, almost from its beginning in the north, a kingdom that is doomed among a people that is not. Whereas in the south, you have the kingdom itself is also of and for God. And so in the southern kingdom, God has to protect not only the people, but something to do with the kingdom as well. Or, if you focus on how the prophets view it, something to do with the king itself. The kingdom as it stands in the south, as it turns out, is as disposable as the kingdom in the north. And it's only the king that's not, in the line of the kings. But we can get that from listening to the prophets, but from the text of history, it's still hard to understand that. We still see in this historical narrative the promise that Judah is somehow different and better than Israel. But here we're called to see, but are they? They've been screwing up pretty badly recently. Ahaz is bad guy. They're doing all of the things that are cited as the reasons that the northern kingdom is experiencing this consequence. Is Judah immune to the experiencing the same consequence? Is a question that should be on all of our minds right now. Or does their special relationship with God somehow protect them from any of that consequence? And what is that relationship of what is it unique and special about Judah that God will preserve, and how will he do that? Are questions that will walk with us through the rest of this study and through and beyond, all the way to Jesus Christ and beyond, or where these things ultimately lead us, because Judah also is deported ultimately. Isaiah talked about it. We know it's coming as well. And so we see what God cares about in this is not what this text has led us so far to believe is important, which is where seeing these things with the eyes of the prophets rather than the eyes of history is so beneficial. Because history is about armies and land and kingdoms and money and things in the world that we can easily see and trace. But to God, what's important is the people who don't get recorded in history books, is how they love and serve God. And it's carving out for them an environment in which they can do that freely. And that's where we're going. But there will be more turmoil between here and there. Again, as we see, Judah has problems that have to be addressed as well. And as we've continued to see with how we've looked at the kings of the north and the north is more disposable than the south, because there is this permanent dynasty of the kings in the south. And the people seem to be making the mistake of believing that the promise of an eternal kingship is the same as the promise of an eternal kingdom. And those are not the same. Having the kingship exist in an unbreaking line does not guarantee the preservation of the kingdom. And just as a brief teaser, as we follow these people into exile in the second part of this study, we'll see a people having to come to terms with the breakdown of that belief that they held, that they were going to be protected in their kingdom by God because he promised them a king, and having to realize that what God meant and what they thought God meant are not the same, and that the culpability for their actions still can catch up to them, and that they're not immune to consequences from their actions. So that'll be a rude awakening for Judah, and as we kind of tie a bow here a little bit more on Israel, then we will transition strongly into watching them have the realization of them not being quite as immune to consequences as they believe themselves to be. So, Assyria's resettlement plan involves moving people out and moving people in. So we've done the moving people out. Here we do the moving in people from all over the place. And it turns out, as that's happening, they have a little problem of being murdered by lions. And they decide that it's because they don't know appropriately how to worship the God of the land, which is funny on about 5 different levels, not even the top of which having to do with them being murdered by lions. But how did the people who lived there before do at serving the Lord? Not well. And yet, they did not seem to have the same lion-related problems that the new inhabitants are having. God is making a point. And he's explicitly making it to the new inhabitants of the land. So I've been saying this land ultimately is not the thing that's important. And while that is true, it's also not entirely true. When you see new inhabitants of the Holy Land that is so far viewed as God's, God is not giving up his claim entirely on this land yet just because Assyria owns it and random outsiders are living there. If you live in this land, you're still expected to understand that he is the God of this land and to have some familiarity with that. So they scrounged up a priest from the northern kingdom. What kind of exactly things he would have to say are a little questionable because, again, if you're really being a good priest of God, how can you not encourage people to go offer the mandatory sacrifices in the city of God? So they bring in somebody who knows more than they do, but who is clearly non-expert in the matter of the worship of the Lord, but knows more than all of these foreigners to at least help instruct them in how to be pleasing enough to the Lord that maybe the lion attacks will stop. And that sets the stage for what becomes the kingdom of Samaria at Jesus' time, is the worship of God is not foreign in that land. It's just all of these other people are bringing with them all of their own heritages and religious practices. It would be one among many. But, I mean, that's even not unusual for how the Israelites behaved there. This is not wildly different from how it would have been before when the Israelites were there. It's not Israelites. And there are apparently more lions. So it's the irony that the people coming in who have no background at all in the Lord would be immediately more interested in trying to at least observe the forms of serving the Lord than the Israelites who have been deported should not be lost on us. And the fact that God could immediately work that in this transition is nothing short of incredible. And so we should keep in mind as we watch how all of this develops that God has not entirely given up his claim on this parcel of land, even though ultimately we know his kingdom as it comes from Jesus is not a where but a who. Nonetheless, we should watch what keeps happening in this territory. As we alluded to in the previous question, we see here explicitly all of these people are bringing with them their own religious practices as well. So this is sort of very much in the spirit of America, a religious melting pot, where everyone brings their gods, their practices, and we have a priest, at least one priest of the Lord. So it'll create, as you can imagine, in fact, as we saw in this country, when many cultures come together and start melting together, you end up with not so much distinct cultures existing in different pockets, but more and more you have a unified, same thing made up of combinations of different parts of different things. So too are you going to end up with a religion in Samaria that borrows and pulls in different things from different places, and it will more and more stop being separate groups of different practices and more be kind of a thing, and mixed in with that thing will be the worship of God. here we build kind of on the contrast. Again, we're focusing on what does the religious practice look like in this land, and we're seeing they serve the Lord and they do something else. So they appoint their own priests. Again, when you're serving the Lord only, you don't get to appoint priests. They are born. They're not appointed at this point in time. And they serve the Lord and other gods. And these priests also are priests of the high places and these other gods. Presumably these are multi-denominational priests who are fluent in many of these different rites or practices that are happening. Again, everything is mixing together. So it's God and, which is an interesting development to the credit of the people coming in. It was sort of, let's do away with God before, when it was Israel, when they got their worst. They didn't even want the God part of it. They wanted to get rid of that completely and just worship Baal. And in fact, they were routinely trying to abandon entirely the worship of the Lord. Here, there's not that. It's integrating instead of abandoning. Somehow, the people of Israel managed, again, to reject the worship of God, their God, who brought them out from the slavery in the land of Egypt, more than these foreigners who have no vested interest in God whatsoever, other than maybe wanting to avoid being attacked by lions. But that's not really going to be a very strong motivator after a lot of time. They've just adapted to, that is another one of the traditions that they're practicing. And it's a coexistence of this and this. It's a strange thing to see happen to the worship of the Lord, because as we know, God is a jealous God and has resisted where he has maintained control of his people. He's adamantly resisted allowing them to introduce anything else alongside. So we know in the south there is another religious tradition cropping up that Ahaz, the king, has brought into the kingdom and is encouraging at the expense of the worship of the Lord, though. He set it up in the temple and he closed the doors to the temple. So while in theory he's not punishing and persecuting people worshiping the Lord, he set up this new thing kind of in place of where the worship of the Lord is. So in the south, they're not doing very well right now. We should again continue to keep in our minds. You could argue that things are not worse in the new kingdom of the north for worship of the Lord than they are in the south, where things are supposed to still be good. It's just a big mess all the way around. And although there's been some radical change, we're still going to need to see a little bit more change before this can get cleaned up. So if you need a primer, and it appears these people in the new kingdom of Samaria do, as to the nature of the first commandment, here it is. The first one is that whole thing about serving, loving the Lord alone, right? You've got one God, and that's the only God you get to serve. And so we're experiencing a reminder here. The new people coming in are not really going to be able to add in, even though they think they aren't really going to be able to add in with their other religions serving the Lord. Because the first principle in serving the Lord is that the Lord is the only God you can serve. So that religious practice is fundamentally incompatible with how they're trying to add it. And so it will create and continue to create a fascinating tension in the north. So much so that when we see ultimately the people of the south are deported and are allowed to return and are dedicated more than ever to the worship of the Lord, their neighbors to the north are actively hostile against them. And as a result of how this sort of evolves, they are incapable of it. That idea of you either serve just God or you're not really serving God at all, ends up taking hold, and they end up not really serving God at all. So they know a little bit about him, and knowledge and worship of the Lord isn't completely gone from the land, but they're not really at all truly worshiping the Lord. And they end up standing in opposition to that, which is the source ultimately of hostility between Judah and Samaria. Not that there aren't other political reasons as well, but that is one of the underlying sources of that hostility. Is the North fundamentally ends up having a chance here to accept God, but they get stuck on that first thing. And if you can't get the first one right, how are you going to do with the other ones? Which of course brings us to how this plays out in our lives today as well. Probably pretty obviously, but it's worth mentioning. If you can't get that first part right, that God is the one that you serve, first, foremost, above all else, then you're not really serving God. And that can, whether you mean it to or not, ultimately lead you to even develop a hostility to God and to the things of God. And so the call for reflection here for all of us is to think on our own lives. Is God that first thing? Is he the last thing you would ever part with or make a decision against? Is he the primary and most important thing in your life? And if not, as we see play out in Samaria, maybe that means he's nothing. As much as we like to think, I can have it halfway, right? I can have God and the high-paying job and the fancy car, and I can't always make it to church, but I give a bunch of money, whatever, or even, or whatever example it is for you, whatever is the thing that you're tempted to place alongside God. When we try to intermingle all of those things as co-equal, we're missing that first and most important rule. They don't mingle. God has to be first. And where that's not true, you are not really worshiping God. And you've created a thing that is incompatible with God. And you won't be pleased. You might as well not even try, honestly, at that point, to worship God. Because he's not going to be happy with it. And you're going to get in the way of your empty pursuits of what seem like fun, but won't be when you realize that it's actually very empty. But you're not doing yourself any great favors by leaving God in that mix. Other than, of course, keeping before your mind the fact that, there is this other thing I could be doing. But I like this. It's nice to keep that tension, I suppose, of being aware that there is this other choice you could be making. But to really actually be pleasing to God and to earn any spiritual merit for yourself or to have any hope of seeing heaven, God has to come first and everything else second. We've already talked about this quite a bit in this video, but this makes it clear that as it was set up in the beginning, so it continued for generations and generations. St. Thomas Aquinas said, an error in the beginning is an error indeed. And how true that can be. If you set something up badly and full of errors and expect that it will fix itself later down the road, that's not what happens. And we are, I think, sometimes prone to thinking, I'm kind of close right now, and it'll just get, and this is the best I can do. It'll get better later down the road. It'll improve because I'm doing okay. That's not really a recipe to improvement. That's a recipe to stay exactly the same as you are. And of course, as Christians, we're not called to stay exactly the same as we are. If that were good enough, Jesus Christ would not have needed to die to save us from our sins. We are called to not be as we are, but to be different and better than as we are through the grace that he seeks to give us. We should all work on that. Israel, no more. We're going to talk about Samaria now, and the same land, different people. But mostly now we will talk about what's going on down south. And we know that things aren't going that smoothly now, and we know from Isaiah that this new guy is supposed to be, let us hope, quite a bit better than the previous guy, and so maybe there's still hope. And, we might be able to just get it all sorted out and keep going as we have been.